I am thrilled to welcome my friend, Jeff Selingo, to his first in-person events for FAN. Last night, he and Ron Lieber were at Francis Parker, which is the first time I saw Jeff in 3D. We had hosted him on Zoom in both 2020 and 2021, so it's nice to see how tall he is and what kind of suit he wears. He was in conversation, as mentioned, with Ron Lieber, who is the Your Money columnist for the New York Times. It was fabulous. That recording will be on the FAN website and our YouTube channel in another day or two, so take a look at that as well. Jeff has written about higher education for more than 2 decades and is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 books. His latest book is for sale out there, and I don't have one in my hand. I should be flashing it around. Bright yellow cover. Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, named among the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. He's a regular contributor to The Atlantic. He's a special advisor for innovation and professor of practice at Arizona State University, so great resource to talk about ASU, really interesting school. He also writes one of the best newsletters that I get in my inbox called Next. Fabulous newsletter. I read the whole thing, and my kid's graduating from college in about another 2 semesters, so you gotta tune into that. And he co-hosts a very fascinating podcast called Future You, so lots of resources from Team Selingo, all of one Jeff Selingo. Joining Jeff on stage is one of my new best friends. He just doesn't quite know it yet, Dr. Andy Borst. He might have an inkling. I laugh at his jokes. The director of undergraduate admissions at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He has over 20 years' experience in higher education, working at multiple flagship universities, regional campuses, and liberal arts colleges. Dr. Borst is often cited in national news stories regarding admissions policies and practices, and for ethical considerations in enrollment. He recently chaired the Admissions Practices Committee for the Illinois Association of College Admissions Counseling. And now, no further ado, Jeff Selingo, Dr. Andy Borst.
We have about an hour together. I have some questions that we're going to walk through to learn a little bit more about Jeff and his book, but this is intended to be kind of a back and forth so we can talk about the book and in the context of what's going on at the University of Illinois, higher education in general. Jeff, welcome to the Shire in the land of Lincoln. Thank you very much for joining us and spending some time with us this evening. You're a best-selling author. You're a regular contributor to many different places, the Wall Street Journal, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Atlantic. You've been in the higher education sphere for a long time, but what motivated you to write about who gets in and why in college admissions?
So before I answer that, I want to thank Stevenson for having me tonight. Thank you for coming out to this live event. Thank you to Lonnie and the Family Action Network for having me in person, as Lonnie said, in 3D. It's a great organization. I love all the programs that they put on, and so highly encourage you to follow them. And also thank you to Andy. I've been following Andy on Twitter particularly over the last couple of years. I think he's one of the best explainers in chief of college admissions from the other side of the desk. And as long as Twitter's around, I encourage you to follow him if you really want to know about college admissions. So thank you, Andy, for joining me tonight. So I've been covering higher education for 25 years, and 16 of that at the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the trade magazine for colleges and universities. And so whenever I would travel around and talk to parents and students, they always said, oh, I can never get into my alma mater today, or, oh, it's so hard to get into college. And I said, well, what are you talking about? It's really not that hard to get into college. In fact, the average acceptance rate of an American college or university today is 65%. So most colleges accept most students. And then as I started to dig deeper, I realized that we were talking about a set of colleges and universities that really we're fascinated with, right? And these are the selective colleges and universities. So let's just put some numbers around it. So there are more than 4,000 colleges and universities according to the U.S. Education Department. That's a lot, right? Most of them are pretty small. 40% of the U.S. higher education market is under 1,000 students. So we're talking a lot of tiny colleges out there. Now, when you're thinking, well, how about all those colleges, you know, big residential colleges, things like that, 4-year colleges, let's put the 2-year colleges aside for a second. We're still talking about a universe of maybe about 1,200. 1,200 colleges and universities, 4-year residential colleges. Of that, about 200 of them are what we call selective colleges and universities, meaning they admit about 50% or fewer of their applicants, so fewer than 1 in 2. So they're talking about 200 colleges and universities. And that is really the universe that I know a lot of students and parents, especially at schools like this, are constantly thinking about. And I wanted to know what has changed there, because it's clear that when you do look at the numbers, that, and I did this because in 1994, I interned at US News and World Report working on their college rankings. And when I was thinking about writing this book, I pulled out the rankings from 1990, 91, when I would have been applying to college. And I looked at the acceptance rates. And when you looked at the acceptance rates, I thought they were typos. Because the University of Pennsylvania, for example, in 1991, so Penn, accepted 42% of students. Today they accept probably, well actually they don't even tell you their acceptance rate anymore. It's like 5%, right? The Ivies, even back then, accepted 20+% of applicants. Now they're all in the single digits. So clearly, since the 1990s, something has changed. And so that combined with a book that I reread a couple of years ago called The Gatekeepers, which was written by Jack Steinberg, who was a reporter at the New York Times, who went inside the process at Wesleyan University 20 years ago, when again, the process was very different. And so I felt that there was a need to write a book talking about what has changed in college admissions, particularly since Gen X parents are now seeing their Gen Z kids apply to college. So what has changed essentially in that generation between Gen X and Gen Z? And that was really the purpose of this book, to take you inside the process to help guide you through something that not only changed since you might have gone to college, but has really changed even in the last 10 years.
Okay. So one of the reasons I agreed to be on that stage with you is so I could be first in line for you to sign my book at the end of this. But let's talk more about the book itself. In preparation, you embedded yourself in 3 different admissions offices: large urban institution, private institution, Emory, so highly selective, admit rate about 19%.
Yeah.
A small liberal arts college, Davidson, similar admit rates, and then a large public institution, University of Washington, Seattle, very similar to the University of Illinois in terms of admit rate, roughly about 60%, but I think that there's some selectivity depending on if you're a resident, non-resident, by program as well. Learning about the admissions offices from the inside, you have a unique perspective that I'm hoping that you can share with us, particularly around assumptions about the admissions process. What was some of the biggest takeaways that you had in watching the admissions process in the committee rooms as decisions happen, and what are some of the biggest misconceptions? You talked about the admit rate, and what is a selective institution, or the anxiety that builds around selectivity that you can share with us tonight.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is we tend to talk about admissions as a process. It's not a process, right? 3 colleges, and you might say, well, I'm not really interested in either of any of those 3 colleges that you mentioned, but they all have some similarities about how they evaluate students. But they're all very different, right? No 2 colleges really operate their admissions offices in exactly the same way. So even though we talk about admissions as a process, once your application leaves your hands and arrives in the hands of admissions offices, how they evaluate it, how they think about it, how they talk about the students, and how they eventually admit them or deny them is very different. And so that's one of the things that really surprised me, is I was in these 3 offices and they thought very differently about how they evaluated students, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the depth and breadth of the applicant pools. I didn't really have an appreciation for. You know, at the year I was at Emory, they received more than 30,000 applications. They were probably going to accept about 8,000 for a class of a couple of thousand, right? So I didn't really have an appreciation for what 35,000 applications might look like. I don't know, how many applications are you going to get this year?
Oh, we can't talk about this year, but last year we
year?
had 63,000, which is double that we had 10 years ago.
Yes. So, I mean, the numbers are kind of overwhelming to think about, but the thing that I didn't quite understand was the depth of them. There was a moment when we were at Emory and we were reviewing applications, and I said to one of the admissions officers, I said, well, we just read this application like 2 applications ago. And they said, no, it's a different student, right? So we tend to think, you know, within this school where you kind of stand, You might know, you might have friends at other schools, so you kind of know where you stand maybe in this region or maybe a little bit in a couple of neighborhoods. But then just replicate what is happening here at 25,000 high schools in the US, and then replicate that around the world, and this just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm not telling you that to depress you or to discourage you from applying to schools like the University of Illinois or other selective institutions, but sometimes I think that we think, oh wow, we have this, right? We have, you know, we have great grades in these courses, and we do all these activities, and we got a 1550 on the SAT or whatever it is. So do many other people. And so that's the thing that I didn't quite appreciate. So first, there's no such thing as a process. Second is the breadth and depth of the applicant pool. The third is probably the most important, and that is that college admissions is not really about the applicant. It is about the institution. The institution, higher education, is a business. And institutions have priorities, just like companies have priorities, and they deliver those priorities through the admissions office. And so every year at different colleges, they have different priorities. Those priorities might be, we need more full-pay students. We may need more students from the Dakotas. We might want more men. We might want more students who major in the humanities. We might want more low-income students. We might want more diversity here or there, right? It's all these priorities that come through the admissions office. Or they might be more narrow. We might need a third baseman for the baseball team. We might need a bassoon player for the orchestra in a particular year. So there's all of these priorities. So as I look out at this auditorium, if this is the freshman class at an institution, yes, there's all these open seats, but first of all, there's all these applicants competing for these seats, and then some of these seats are literally reserved for certain types of students, the athletes, the people on the debate team, the orchestra, things like that, and other special talents or other special needs that the institution has. And that's one thing that I didn't quite appreciate when I was outside of the process. Once I started sitting in the process and I saw how they were making these decisions, I started to see that it was more about the institution and less about them. And I tell you that tonight because I think that the more that you go into the process, understanding that there's a lot you can control, and we'll be talking about that tonight, but there's also a lot out of your control. And just admitting that and knowing that walking into the process, I think is really important because we tend to talk a lot about how unfair admissions is, or it should be based on merit. And it's those two words that, Andy, that really bother me. I don't know what you think about those, right? But first of all, if I went around this room, none of us can really define what we mean by merit. If you're a great test taker, you might say SAT score, most important thing when it comes to merit. If you're great in the sciences, you might say the sciences are the most important, right? Whatever is most important to you often is because of what we're good at. And then second is fairness. And fairness is often, again, in the context of the school or the way the person was brought up and the resources these students had, right? So what is fair to me is very different than what is fair to you. And I think that, again, when we talk about college admissions, there's so many applicants competing for such a small number of seats that those two words in particular, I think, get conflated in the process for what we're really talking about.
Right. So you mentioned about students competing for spots at an institution, but I think your book does a great job of framing institutions competing for students along the spectrum of buyers and sellers as you frame them in the book. Can you talk about what are the characteristics of the institutions that you described as buyers versus the characteristics of the institutions that are sellers?
Well, this is an important distinction in the book because, as I mentioned earlier, 200 colleges that are selective in some way. They admit only about half of their applicants. So that means there are hundreds and hundreds of other colleges out there that have open spots, and in many cases, they want you. And they want you in a way that they're willing to offer you a discount to get you to come there. And so I decided that in the admissions process, it's very important for you to know which of these schools are those buyers, meaning that they're willing to essentially offer discounts to students to buy them to come. And it's important to remember and I say this often in the book, that just because a school is a buyer doesn't mean that they are of a lesser quality. There are some schools that are the sellers. There's only about 50 of those overall, so 50 out of thousands of colleges that are sellers, which means that they have more applicants than they know what to do with, and they don't need to offer any sort of discount to get you to come. Because they have so many people that want to go there, they reject most of their applicants anyway, and so when they put out money for financial aid, they put out money mostly based on need. And so what I found, and the reason why I decided to make this delineation in the book, is because I found when I was reporting the book and talking to students and families, they were applying to college and they didn't think about the financial piece, the financial fit. They would often talk about the academic fit, and they would often talk about the social fit. And to them, financial aid was a black box, right? Like, college is expensive, we know that. We're going to figure out how to pay for it later on. Let's just see if we could get in. And I thought that was really a wrong way to think about it, because in many ways, what was happening was that students were getting into some of these colleges that were sellers, but then because they were above the cutoff for financial aid, they didn't get any financial aid. Meanwhile, there were all these other schools out there that were buyers that were willing to not only accept them, but give them a substantial amount of financial aid, merit-based aid, or non-need-based aid, so not based on financial need. And I thought that it was really important for students to really think about this up front. So let me just quickly go through what's a buyer and seller and even give some examples. So again, sellers are schools, they have something to sell, usually a brand name, way many more applicants than they have seats, about 50 of them. Most of their aid is based on need. Now, they might be very generous with that need-based aid, but 95% of their aid goes to need-based aid. The vast majority of colleges are what I call buyers, in that they have to offer some sort of discount to fill their seats. And those discounts sometimes go to students based on need, but more often go to students based not on need, but that they want those students because of their academic record. And a great example of this is one of the schools I was at. So Emory is a seller. 90% of its financial aid goes to need-based aid. 90% goes to need-based aid. Because, as you said earlier, their acceptance rate is 19%. It's actually lower now. It's more like 12%, right? So they don't necessarily need to offer discounts to students to get them to fill seats. Meanwhile, one of its competitors, Tulane, is a buyer. More than 50% of its financial aid is non-need-based aid, meaning most of its money are going to students whose parents could afford college, or under the government formula, could afford college. They're giving out a lot more merit aid than Emory is, because in Tulane's mind, they need to do that to fill their seats. Now, academically, very similar schools, but they have a very different philosophy when it comes to merit aid and need-based aid. And one of the easiest ways to figure this out, and then I'll let us go on, is looking at something called a common data set. So almost every school fills out this big data set called the common data set. It's a big survey. Most of them put it on their website. Not every school does, but most do. So if you Google Emory and common data set, or Tulane and common data set, you can find this out. You'll see this big data set. It's many, many pages, great data on admissions and financial aid. And there's a section there that talks about institutional financial aid. And they say how much money they spend on need-based aid, and they show how much money they spend on non-need-based aid. If a school spends more money on non-need-based aid, they're more likely to be a buyer. If they spend a lot more money on need-based aid, they're more likely to be a seller. And the most important part as you're thinking about this is that when you're balancing your list, when you're applying, you just want a mixture of schools. You don't want all sellers, because if you have all sellers, you're likely not to necessarily get in to college. But if you do get in, they may not offer you the aid that you need to go, especially if you don't qualify for the need-based aid. So it's an important thing to think about as we think about fit, because when we think about fit, We often think about social fit and academic fit. We often don't think about financial fit until it's too late in the process.
So we see this play out in a local context, particularly for the University of Illinois, and I hear this many times from families in the north suburbs of, why is it that the University of Illinois is not offering me any scholarships? And to Jeff's point, we're spending roughly about $120 million in aid to students. 90% of that is going towards need-based funds. There's a program called Illinois Commitment, which makes it so families of $67,500 or less have tuition and fees covered. That's a large amount. It's become our largest dollar expense short of faculty salaries for the institution. But then where are the scholarships in contrast to another state flagship institution that may be offering significant scholarships to the students and feeling wanted because of that merit aid? Can you talk a little bit about the perception from students and getting and feeling wanted, getting that merit aid versus the institutions that are doing the need-based funds?
Yeah, and in many ways, I talk about this being a coupon, because that's essentially what it is. Now, colleges don't call them coupons. They don't even call them discounts. They call it merit aid or merit scholarships because it sounds fancier. And if you're telling somebody else that your kid got a scholarship, it sounds better than you got a coupon, right? But in many ways, they're doing exactly what Macy's does to get you in the store. Because what they're doing is they're saying, okay, our list price is $75,000 or $70,000 or $60,000 all in. Mostly privates, right? But if you're a public, maybe $40,000 all in. And what they're saying is, okay, there are very few people that are going to pay that full price to come here, that can pay that full price or that want to pay that full price. They know that up front. And so they say, okay, we're going to discount it by $10,000 because an algorithm that we have put together with some financial geeks that we have on our staff, or most likely a consultant that they hired, has determined that if we give this family from the north suburbs of Chicago $10,000, or maybe if we gave them $10,500, they're more likely to come here. And that's worth it to the college because, yes, they have to cut $10,500 off their price, but you're still bringing to the door $50,000 or $40,000. So you're still bringing cash, whether that's through loans or other scholarships or other savings that you have. You're still bringing cash to the door. So on average, colleges are discounting their tuition 50%. The average discount rate is now 50%. It's no different than when you go and get a seat on an airplane, when you go to a hotel. There are some people that pay this price, there are some people that pay this price, and there are some people that pay this price. And part of your job in searching for colleges is to figure out not only where the right academic fit is and the right social fit, but also where that financial fit is going to be and where they may ask you to pay the full price, or they may ask you to pay half that price or less than half that price. And some colleges are really aggressive about this. The University of Alabama, I think, is among the publics, is probably the most aggressive. And why is that? Because the University of Alabama loves out-of-state students. They want more of them. They also want students that have better academic background than many of the in-state students that they could get. And so what they're doing is essentially buying students from other states to come to Alabama. In the book, I talk a lot about Northeastern University in Boston, which did this largely to rise in the rankings. And you're wondering, well, how does that work? So back in 20 years ago, Northeastern University ranked about 150 in the national universities, and they thought they needed to be in the top 100. Today, they're in the top 50. Well, how did they do that? They knew that people wanted to go to Boston to go to college, but they wanted to go to Boston University, or they wanted to go to Boston College, or Tufts, or Harvard, or MIT. And so what they did was they started to offer kids that had really good SAT scores and really good grades, whether they had money or not, they started to give them a lot of merit aid to get them to come. And they started to go to Northeastern. And suddenly, Northeastern's SAT scores, the kids with their high school grades, everything started to go up. And when they started to go up, so did their rankings. And so over the course of 10 years, their rankings went from 150 to 125 to 75, and now they're in the top 50. And they did it by using merit aid to attract those top students.
So I'm going to move us a little further in the book. We're past November 1. We're almost to December 1,
Yep.
where the University of California applications are due. A little bit more time.
Yeah, it's a couple hours.
So applications are in. When you were in the admissions committee rooms, you got to see what happens in the black box of holistic college admissions. You talked about the process before. Can you give the folks who are joining in tonight some insight about what does that black box look like? What do the conversations look like, and how do decisions get made?
So as I said, there's no one single process, but in general, here's what happens when your application arrives in the admissions office, and maybe Andy can talk a little bit about how it works at the University of Illinois. So they open up your file, and it's either read by a single reader at first, followed by a second reader, or in the case of Emory, they did something which they called committee-based evaluation to try to move through applications faster because they were getting so many more of them, where they would have a pair of readers reading the application at the same time. So they thought that saved a little time in doing that process. They open up your application, and whether it's a single reader or this paired reading approach, the first thing they're looking at, and to be honest with you, the most important thing in that application is your high school transcript. It's the most important thing. As I always say, if we had a starting line right here, if we were running a race and we were all on the same starting line, to get to, and the finish line was the acceptance at the back of the auditorium, at many of these places, that transcript would get you more than half the way there. That's how important it is. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Control what you could control. You could control what courses you take in high school and somewhat what grades you get in high school. And that is the most important thing to a lot of these colleges. Why is that? It's probably the research you've done at the University of Illinois. It's the research every college and university has done. It's the research they've done at the national level. We know that grades in high school predict success in college. College admissions offices want to accept students who are going to stay in college and eventually graduate. And what they know from the research is that high school courses and grades matter to completion. In other words, if you took a rigorous set of courses in high school and you scored and you did well in those courses, you got good grades in those courses, you are more likely to stay in college and graduate. You're more prepared for college. So what they're looking for are rigorous courses. They want to make sure that you, especially at these really selective colleges, that you have really maxed out on your math and your science courses, on English. They want to make sure that you have a good college-going transcript. They want to make sure that your grades are pretty steady. They don't mind grades that are on the upswing. They like grades that are pretty consistent. They definitely don't like grades that are going like this from 9th grade to 12th grade, and they don't like grades that are all over the place. So that's what they're looking for in the transcript, and it's where they spend the most time. So they might read an application for 8, 10, 12 minutes. Not much time, right? And most of that time is spent really analyzing that transcript. Now you might say, well, there's 25,000 high schools in this country, right? How do they know? How do they know the differences between these high schools? So when the application comes in, it comes in with something called the high school profile. And with that profile, they know what courses are offered by that high school, and they know a lot of other information about that high school. But most important on the high school profile, they know what courses are offered. And so what they're going to look at, and in most cases they know the high schools well enough, like you know this high school, you know the courses well enough that you know that, oh, they have these courses available and this student took these courses. Again, they want to make sure that given what was available to you, that you kind of tried your hardest, right? That you took those difficult courses, that you didn't find the easy way out. That's what they're looking for when they look at that transcript. And then they look at everything else. If there's a test score, they'll look at that test score at that point. And does it confirm what they're seeing in the transcript, or doesn't it, right? It usually matches up, but that's what they're trying to look at. They'll look at the essay. I will be honest with you. For how much time students spend on the essay, there's a lot of speed reading of essays because a lot of them sound alike. They write about similar topics. It's a way to shine, I think, but it's not a way, it's not the way in, right? It's not the one thing that will get you in. They'll look at your list of extracurricular activities. They want to make sure that you have a variety of extracurricular activities. And then, they'll talk about a decision at that point. But the most important thing is that transcript.
Yep. This book is one of the best perspectives that I've read, that I thought, this is how it really works at my job. Balancing competing priorities, trying to build a large class of students that can succeed at our institution. As I read through how the description looked at for Emory and Davidson and Washington, Seattle looked the most like the University of Illinois. The only differences that I would see are you described a subjective rating scale, and then the dean of admission kind of drawing a line of like, this is where we have capacity. Our process is a little different at the University of Illinois, where we're not adding a subjective rating scale. So I'm not reading your essay and saying, oh, it's another Lego essay. I'm going to give you a 4. Or you're talking about how you're going to contribute to society. Use engineering to contribute to society. That's a 6. That doesn't happen. Our reviewers are saying, I'm going to look through your whole application, primarily looking at your transcript as you described. What courses did you take? There's 1,000 students in the graduating class of Stevenson. We get approximately 500 applications, and we're looking for reasons to admit those students. It's our largest feeder. The decisions that happen are either admit, waitlist, or deny. And so I will personally read about 3,000 applications. We have a team of 68 full-time staff. We hire an additional staff of 75 seasonal readers. They're going through and doing multiple reads until we agree. So the first person may say admit, second person may say deny. We're going to go to the third, says waitlist. We go to a fourth read. Fourth person says admit. You're in the admit pile. And then we start to shape the class. Something that was similar that I read to the University of Washington, Seattle, is that there's big variations by major. At the University of Illinois, some of our programs have become very highly selective. Computer science stands out as one of the most competitive that's offered at our institution. And that's what I like about working at Illinois, in that we have one program that has an admit rate below 10%. And then we have many other programs. We roughly have 183 different admission standards, where we have other programs where we're more than happy to take a student that is really kind of on the margins of college ready. And the distance between those two programs. So you're applying to the University of Illinois, you're picking 2 majors. We're going to consider you for your first choice, and then we're going to consider you for your second choice, and then that's it. So you may have a student who's applying for, say, mechanical engineering and industrial engineering, 2 very competitive programs. They may get denied because they just weren't good enough for those 2 programs. Meanwhile, a student who is applying for a program that's looking to grow, usually in the humanities, social science, they may be admitted even though they didn't take the most rigorous courses, maybe didn't get those A's, maybe B's, maybe even had a C that they were able to explain to us. And so there's a huge amount of variance in the type of programs. And so the question is, well, why do you do that? You're asking a 17 and 18-year-old to describe what do they want to do with their life. And it's really about program capacity. If I just took the best students, I would have a lot of really good computer science students that wouldn't be able to take the classes that they need to graduate in a timely fashion. So that's why we are trying to align what's our program capacity with what's student interest to try and build a cohort of roughly about 8,000 students that's representative of Illinois, that has augmented in academic quality from non-resident and international as well.
Yeah, and they often talk about admissions as an art and a science, right? And there is a lot of mixture of that going on in the process. So as Andy mentioned, when Emory is reading these applications, or Davidson or University of Washington, they're giving ratings based on what they're reading. So they're giving ratings based on the transcript. They're giving ratings based on the essay and extracurricular activities. So they're giving all of these ratings. And some of these cases are very easy. It's a very easy admit, or it's a very easy denial. Most cases are like that, right, in these early reads. But then what happens is, inevitably, when they look at the numbers at the end of the process, they've admitted too many students, right? So before they send out those letters to everybody, or they open up their portal to so you can find out if you were admitted, they admitted too many. And so what they have to do in the final weeks before they send out decisions is they shape their class. And this is the process, going back to one of your earlier questions, that I didn't quite understand until I was in it. So initially, they're reading all these applications and they have a rough idea of what their class looks like. And then in early March, before they make their final admissions decisions, they They're looking at that class, and the first thing they realize is, oh, we admitted too many students. Because remember, not everybody who gets admitted says yes. So they have these algorithms that tell them if we admit X number of students, Y number of students will say yes. So they're always like looking at those numbers. And so at that point, that's when they shape the class. They say, okay, we have to cut 1,000 students from our admit pool. How do we do that? And that's when they are looking at things like legacies. They're looking at diversity. They're looking at other special cases. Sometimes they're looking at kids of employees, right? They're looking at all of these special cases as they're shaping the class. And that's the other thing, I guess, that I didn't quite get until I was in the process, is that for some kids, they're getting multiple looks. Their applications are getting multiple looks. And for other kids, they might be getting one look. Again, you might say in the audience, well, that's really unfair. And again, coming into this process, you have to remember, it's not a fair process to begin with, because again, the power is in the hands of the institutions, not necessarily you.
So shaping the class, particularly around the topic of using diversity as a factor within shaping the class. So the U.S. Supreme Court is currently discussing the use of race in admissions. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about, one of the justices brought up a hypothetical situation, and you kind of alluded to it, of comparing two students side by side. When you were embedded in the admissions offices, particularly in the context of diversity, how often did you see student A compared to student B, and student A was going to get in and student B was going to be denied?
Often that really rarely never happened, right, where they're comparing two students. Where diversity, for example, came in was at the very end of the process, where they're looking at the whole class. So in early March, basically the classes, they have their admit bin, they have their deny bin, and they have their wait list bin. And as they're looking at this admit bin, they say, okay, do we have too many kids from the Northeast and not enough kids from the Southwest? Do we have too many women, not enough men? Do we have enough, black students? Do we have enough Hispanic students, right? Like that's when they're looking at the numbers. And that's when, and this is where it happens around the margins, that's when they start to shape, as they call it, shape kids into the school. And what they're looking at are those kids that are just on the outside of the admit bin, right? So they're not pulling kids up that were denied 5 months earlier very easily. What they're looking for is those kids that just about didn't make it in to the admit bin, and they're saying, okay, could we pull them up and get them into this class? Because we need more diversity of a certain kind. And that's where it really happens. It really happens at the margins. So they're not early on in the process taking two kids from Stevenson and saying, well, we have a black student here and a white student here, and yes, the white student has better SAT scores, but we're not going to take him or her, right? They're not doing that. Where diversity play, and this is when I was listening to the Supreme Court arguments, this is the part that I think the justices didn't quite get right, where they think that race, for example, plays a role in admissions at the beginning of the process. It plays a much bigger role at the end of the process.
So what we're expecting, we in admissions, is expecting to happen as a part of the Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit against North Carolina and Harvard, is that the justices, being heavily conservative, represented within the group, is likely to rule that race can no longer be a factor in admissions. I may be wrong, but listening to 6 hours of oral arguments on Halloween night with a decision likely to come at the end of June, it's likely that for next year's cycle, race will not be a factor as a checkbox on the application. It still will likely be a factor in what is the context in your educational experience. What I'm hearing, so the question I often get is, well, what are you going to do if you're not able to consider race as a factor? And I think of conversations that I had with our research park, and that's Fortune 500 companies that have offices on our campus. And they're talking to me about, this is what we want to see for our potential workforce. You need to have a diverse campus, and you need to do everything you can to have a diverse campus and students who can work within a diverse work climate. Because if you can't, we're going to go recruit elsewhere. And from my seat at the University of Illinois, I'm looking at my competitors and how do we compare to Wisconsin and to Purdue. And you walk on campus at the University of Illinois, do you see a diverse campus relative to those two? Not only is it a priority for us as a campus, it's a competitive advantage over our primary competitors. And so we may lose that ability to check a box, but we're going to do everything we can because our intent is first to have a representative campus of the state or of a diverse society, but also that's what the employers are telling us that they're wanting to see from our student from our student population. So that's my charge in when I'm building the class. I want to ask, move on to our next topic here regarding test scores.
Yes.
Did you want to, yeah.
Yeah.
COVID changed a lot in our society in general, but particularly within admissions. Many institutions shifted because students couldn't take the SAT or ACT to being test optional. You've recently written about MIT going back to requiring tests. Purdue came out yesterday and said that they were going to go back to requiring tests. From your perspective, where were test scores used in the admissions process? And I'm really more interested as you look into the crystal ball about where do you think test scores are going to be used in the future, and what advice do you have for students and families when they're asked, when they're considering, should I send my test to a test optional school?
Well, I think that, so test optional was around even before the pandemic. 1,000 colleges and universities were test optional, but most of them were less selective. So during the pandemic, 600 colleges went test optional, many of them selective, including the entire Ivy League. Many have yet to go back. Where I saw testing being used is, first of all, testing was always loved, I thought, more by parents and students than it was loved by people on the admissions side. Why did parents and students like it? Because it gave you a sense of where you stood, right? Because a 1,500 here, or a 1,400, or whatever number you want to put on it, here was the same as it was in San Francisco and New York, California, Florida, whatever. Where a 3-point whatever, an A, it was different by high schools, right? So you kind of knew where you stood, and when you went to apply to college, you would look at their middle 50% of scores, and you would say, okay, this is where I fall. I know that I have a shot of getting in there because my test score is solidly in the middle of that 50%, or maybe it's in the top 25% of scores. It was very clear. And then test optional kind of threw that all out the window. And we've been talking about a very ambiguous process tonight, and now without test scores, it's even more ambiguous. And so I just finished this piece for New York Magazine that appeared, that was published last week. And it talks about the fact that all of these colleges now are test optional. And as a result, what does a test score even mean anymore, right? Because now when you're looking at that middle 50% of test scores, and you could do that by looking at the College Board website, which lists them for most colleges. You could do it by looking at that common data set I was talking about earlier. Many colleges also put it on their admissions websites. That middle 50%, which means, by the way, 25% of test takers got above that and 25% of test takers got below that. Now when you're looking at that, it's only the students who have submitted scores. And so who's going to submit scores? Mostly students who have scored well, right? So suddenly now that middle 50% moves up. So as you're looking at it, you're starting to wonder, well, should I apply there? If their middle 50% is somewhere in the 1,500 range and I have a 1,250 or a 1,300, should I apply there? So that's the first question you ask. The second question then you ask is, if I apply, should I send a score, right? Because I don't have to send one with test optional. And it is really like the question. I bet you it's the question that your counselors get all the time is, should I send the score? And so here's my advice. My first piece of advice is talk to your counselor about it, because they know, I'm not trying to shrug it off on you, but they know the context of your high school, and they also know the context of your high school with the colleges that you're applying to. But in general, the advice that I'm hearing from colleges is, number one, if you can take a test, take it, just to have a score, right? Because you can have a score. Then you could determine kind of where that places you with the colleges that you're thinking about. And then you could try to figure out if you're in that middle 50% or in the upper 25%, probably send the score if it's going to tell something else about your story. Because remember, that application that you're sending to colleges, it's like they're a judge on the other side, right? And you want to present information to them that makes you look your best. And if that score, if you think that test score is going to be additive to your application, then you should send it. But if you don't think it's going to, then you probably should talk to your counselor about potentially holding it back. Now, every year, students are getting accepted without test scores, and they're getting accepted with test scores. And part of the problem now is that most colleges are not being very transparent about who's getting accepted and who's not with and without test scores and what those test scores are. So I get it. If I'm on your side of the, I'm on that side of the auditorium, I'm thinking, geez, what do I do? But again, I think talk to your counselors. I think try to get a test score if you can, because it kind of gives you an indication of where you stand. Then you could look within that data for the 5, 10, 15 schools that you're applying to, and you could determine, well, maybe I send it to this set of schools, but I don't send it to that set of schools.
Right. So I'll add a little bit of the University of Illinois, because it has been interesting sitting on this side of the desk, because it was really difficult to conceive how we would implement a test optional practice before the pandemic hit. And then we had to figure it out. And what I learned from not having test scores is that it was really just a data point. It was really helpful for me to see a test score if I didn't know the school very well, if I couldn't really understand the curriculum. But if you're at Stevenson, or really any of the schools that are represented within the FAN network, we know your high school really well. I don't need to see your test score, because if I can see your full curriculum from your self-reported academic record and I can see your grades, I can really accurately guess how you would have done anyway. And a good test score might be able to heal the sick, but it can't wake the dead. Right. So if you got multiple C's and you have a really great test score, it's really not going to sway us, but it may provide another validating data point that we didn't have, but I don't have to see it. So if you have any sort of inclination of I'm not sure about sending it or not, just don't. Or if you feel really good about it, send it and we'll take a look.
So your assumption is not going to be that they came from Stevenson and they didn't send a score, so that must mean it's not a good score.
We are
That's
not assuming that, and we train our reviewers not to have that assumption. Okay. But I know that there are some schools that do that.
Yes, because there are some schools that might think, well, they go to a really good public high school, and they didn't, and a lot of other kids from that school are sending us scores, and this kid didn't, so what does that mean?
Right.
I mean, it's really hard, right? Trust me, I've talked to so many people for this story, so many counselors, so many college admissions officers, and as Stu Schmill, who's the Dean of Admissions at MIT, told me, Stu has been Dean of Admissions at MIT for 15 years, he's been working in admissions for 20 plus years. And he told me, he said, I have parents whose kids are not applying to MIT, who live in my neighborhood, and they ask me, they tell me what their scores are, and they tell me where they're applying, and they said, Stu, should we send the score? And he said, I have no idea. And he works in admissions at MIT, and he has no idea what to advise. So this is unfortunately the reality that you're facing, and as another high school counselor told me, if you get in and you sent a score, you're going to think, I did it right. If you sent the score and didn't get in, you're going to think you did it wrong. And if you didn't get in and you didn't send a score, you're going to think you did it wrong. Whatever happens, you're going to think you did it wrong if you don't get in. And again, what I think is important, and even judging from my book, is that there's not one thing that gets you in or doesn't get you in. It's that full file that really makes the difference.
So students might be applying to several different colleges. You referenced the University of Illinois in your book, so I'm going to bring it up now. So students are likely to receive multiple offers because there's that anxiety of I'm going to apply to all of these places and what happens if I don't get in?
Yeah.
But the reality is students do get in and have multiple choices to pick from. What advice do you have for families and students about evaluating multiple offers? The admissions process has happened, they have admissions offers, they have financial aid scholarships. How do they evaluate the difference in choice sets between where they might eventually choose to enroll, knowing that they can only pick one?
Okay. Finances matter, and don't be shy about that. This is a big purchase. It's a lot of money, and I see families go into deep debt and really scrape by to pay for their kids' college. And that may not be always worth it, right? So if you have multiple offers and you have multiple financial aid offers, it might come down to who's giving me the best deal if you feel like the schools are pretty similar. But okay, so say now you've said, okay, well, the financial aid offers are pretty similar and the schools are pretty similar. So what should I be looking for? Here's the advice I always give. You want to look for a school that has a good academic fit. And what do I mean by that? Does it offer the major that you want to major in, obviously, but does it offer a number of other things that you might be interested in? Because you might go to school and you might decide your freshman year to change majors. So is it easy to change majors, and is it easy to potentially transfer schools within the university? Can you do that? Number one. Number two, academic fit also means who are your classmates? Are they going to kind of pull you along, or are you going to be at a place, and this is the problem sometimes with merit aid that I worry about, right? So some of these schools are offering you a ton of money because they really want the smartest kids there, but the bulk of the student body, they're just kind of there to be there, right? And are you going to be that kid who's going to be so far ahead, you're going to be swimming so far ahead, and everybody else is just going to be kind of swimming along? And so you want to make sure that you're kind of along with the ride, right? You want to make sure that you have classmates that are as serious about academics as you are, that are kind of keeping you going along. Because what ends up happening is if you're too far ahead, they're going to pull you back. And there's national research on this that even shows that these really talented students end up stopping out and they end up dropping out. Or if you might be way behind the rest of the group, right? And you might be having to struggle to keep up. So when you think about academic fit, you want to make sure that you have an academic fit of your peers, that it's the type of place that academically you fit in. And then socially, you want to make sure that, is sports important to you? Are fraternities important to you? Is residential life important to you? You want to look at all those things that are important to you in terms of fit, and then in terms of social fit. And then finally, we go to school to learn. Right? That's really what a lot of college is about, is the academic piece of it. But yet when you go on tours, they're going to show you the dining halls, they're going to show you the residence halls, the library. When you go into an academic building, you'll probably go into a lobby. You'll never actually walk into a classroom, and you'll never go to see the professor's offices. And this is the other thing that I tell people, because at the end of the day, 10 years after you graduate, 20 years after you graduate, what are you most going to remember about college? You're going to remember the people. You're going to remember the coaches, the professors, your classmates, your mentors that were on staff, advisors, people like that. Those are the people you want to make sure that you see as you're thinking about which college to go to. So, for example, can you go and see a professor in a department that you might major in? Can you go and sit in on a class when you go to a college? Try to go during the academic year and see if you can sit in on a class. Those are the types of things that you're looking for, because at the end of the day, you're going to forget what you learned in Econ 101, but you will not forget the professors and the others on that campus that make a true difference. And if you don't get a feel for that during the college search, and trust me, colleges don't do a great job of this. You have to go and seek it out. If you don't get a good feel for that, you're not going to know exactly which college to pick when you have the pick of a few.
I think that was great advice to end on.